Hey everyone, welcome to another BTM screencast. This week we're going over Chapter 12, Boring and Cutting Tools. So some boring tools we won't be going over, such as the bit braces. We really don't use those anymore. Auger bits we'll be going over in just another minute. And the expansive bits, you really don't need to worry about those either. So if you look at the auger bits here, you can see that there's two different types. One here is fine, and you can tell by the threads on here. And of course, this one is coarse. And this is the part here that does the cutting, the spur. So when these feed into the material that you're cutting, these screws will grab in and they will pull the spurs into it. And then they'll cut from here to here. Some cutting tools are wood chisels. Some of you are familiar with those. We'll be using these in the lab. You use wood chisels to cut wood for hinges, lock sets, and various wood joints. Bench planes, which will be on your tool ID test, are used for smoothing rough surfaces and bringing the work down to a desired size. And block planes are small low-angle planes used to smooth the end grain edges. And if you look here, you can see a block plane. Some of you have seen these already. And again, they're used for the edges here. Small work, you could use one hand. Here's your wood chisel. And this is the cap that goes on the end to keep that sharp. And then here's your bench plane. You can see on this one, you should use two hands, one here and one here. If you were to sharpen them, you should move them back and forth on an oil stone or a whetstone. And you only grind when it's necessary, when the bevel has lost its concave shape. So we'll be looking at that right here. So you can see in this picture the concave shape that the bevel has. Now, we won't be able to see that. It's going to be real slight, but after that, you can see they use a jig right here, and that cuts the bevel on here to make sure that it's at the right angle. When you are sharpening and the concave portion is in here, this is the surface that gets sharpened, and this is the surface that gets sharpened. Next, we'll be talking about snips. We use these for cutting various material on the job. So there's three types of snips. One will cut and put the waste off to the left, one will cut straight, and one will cut and put the waste off to the right. And here, yellow handles are for the straight cuts. Green, it'll curve the material to the right, and then the red ones will curve it to the left. And you can see the different shapes. These are also straight cut. And again, here's the straight cut ones. This is something to be familiar with, but not something you need to pay too much attention to. It's a shingling hatchet, and we won't be covering wood shingles in here, so don't pay too much attention to it. More cutting tools are knives. So utility knives, which many of you are familiar with a retractable razor blade. They're used for general cutting on the job, like drywall. Thin sheet metal can be scored with it, cardboard, and other soft material. Hand scrapers, they remove old paint, dried glue, pencil, crayon, and other marks from wood surfaces. And we'll look at these in just a second. So on the left here, you can see utility knives. Many of you are familiar with these. Here's the retractable razor portion of it. And of course, it gets retracted with that button. To change out the blades, undo the screw, and these usually come apart or butterfly open. and then you're able to change out your blade. This is your scraper here. Up here is also a replaceable razor blade. And again, that's just to scrape certain materials off certain surfaces. So many of you are familiar with saws, and saws use teeth to cut. So saws used to cut across the grain are called crosscut saws, which we'll be looking at in a minute. The teeth are knife-shaped, and they cut wood fibers rather than tear. Saws used with the grain are rip saws, and the teeth are chisel-shaped to shave the wood, much like your wood chisel. Whenever you are sawing a piece of wood, you always saw with the face up. So that means that your finished face, the one that you want to see when you're done, will be the one that's facing up. And here's some examples of some hand saws. And you can see right here, this is a cross-cut saw. He's cutting across. But let's take a look at what those teeth look like. So up top, you can see how a cross-cut saw cuts. Exactly the way it sounds. The teeth are angled like this. And they cut cross. You can see as it goes down. And the gap left where the saw teeth cut is referred to as the kerf. Down on the bottom, you can see the rip saw. If you look at the teeth shape, they're much different than what the crosscut saw is. So if you look at that closer, you can see that it lays a little flatter, and they end up chiseling out instead of cutting through. And again, the gap that's left by the teeth is referred to as the kerf. Some special purpose saws. Compass saws make circular cuts in materials. We'll be seeing those in a minute. The keyhole saws look similar, but the blades are narrower, so they're able to make smaller curved cuts. If you think of a keyhole in a door, that's kind of what a keyhole saw is for. Coping saws are used to cut molding and to make coped joints, and we'll be looking at that in a minute. So up top to the left, you can see a compass saw. And notice the way that the blade's set up. If this were a keyhole saw, it would be a little narrower, so you're able to cut holes with a tighter radius. Your coping saw on the bottom, these are used for cutting trim and stuff along those lines. We'll be going over how to cope if you get to that point. Generally, the coping saw, the blade is very thin because you're going to make more ornate cuts with it. And again, we'll go over that more in lab. So some other special purpose saws. Many of you may have heard of hacksaws. We use those to cut metal. Wallboard saws, which have a variety of names depending on where you work. They're used to cut drywall. Miter boxes, which we will not be using in the lab because we have a miter saw. And pull saws, which it's not bad to be familiar with them, but we will not be using them in the lab. So on the left, there's a picture of a hacksaw. Again, these are used to cut metal. And on the right, we have a wallboard saw, or a drywall saw, jab saw. They're called many things depending on where you're at. And you can see that this looks very similar to a compass saw or a keyhole saw. And it's the same idea, but instead of cutting wood, you cut drywall. To the left, you have your pull saws. And on the right, a miter saw stand. Again, we won't be using this in lab. We'll be using the power version of it. So in conclusion, boring tools and drills are used to make holes in material, regardless of what the material is. Chisels and planes cut recesses and smooth surfaces, so wood chisels, block planes, bench planes. Snips, hatchets, and knives are used to cut metal, shingles, and gypsum board. Handsaws come in many shapes and sizes, which is true. And again, the miter saw, we will not be using the box that they show. We'll be using a power one. And keep in mind that a miter saw is used to cut angles on all sorts of types of wood,